The new library TanStack DB has just been announced and it completely makes React Query obsolete. On top of that, it also changes the way we think of and build modern full-stack applications. So in this video, I want to show you what TanStack DB is, how it works, what are the advantages of using it, and why it is used. On top of that, I have also prepared a presentation to show you how it affects your application's architecture and also the thinking model behind it. Since I have used the library in a project, I have found out that it actually comes with a lot of goodies, especially once you start using it in the code. So that's also something I want to show you in this video. By the way, the library is still in beta, and in my opinion, there are still 2 features that are missing. So if you are using those features in React Query, it would make sense to just wait a little bit till they are available, but we're going to cover all of that in this video. Now, before we dive in, I just want to give a quick shout out to Tanner Linsley, who is the original creator of all TanStack libraries. And I just wanted to share this tweet from him where he talks about TanStack DB, and that TanStack DB is actually the vision that he had for TanStack Query from day one. And before React Query, we didn't really have a standardized way of fetching and synchronizing server state data on the front end, and trying to introduce TanStack DB at once would have been a lot for most of people, so we really needed TanStack Query to achieve that, and TanStack Query took us out of the data fetching stone ages into the modern JavaScript world. And I totally agree with him. There are so many concepts or problems that are related to fetching data and synchronizing with the backend, and trying to jump directly to TanStack DB would probably have been too much at once. And what I find interesting is how React Query could actually only take you 90% of the way, and that last percent is really tricky to get right. And if you used React Query, you know what I'm talking about. Especially when we're dealing with, for example, optimistic updates. That's one of the stuff that really was hard to implement on TanStack Query. It's a typical Pareto principle use case here, where you just have the last 10% that take a lot of energy to implement. And I'm going to do a bit of foreshadowing here, but what we did in React Query was to basically implement a pseudo sync engine on the client, where we're trying to orchestrate between queries and mutations. I'm going to get to all of that in just a bit, but TanStack DB takes care of even more stuff for you so that you can focus on building your applications without having to build repetitive code. Now, how does TanStack DB differ from React Query, and how does it actually work? For that, I have created this small diagram, and it's actually pretty simple. So this is your typical full stack application. You have a front end where you want to show some data to the user, and you get that data from the backend, which in turn gets the data that is stored in a database. Of course, the backend also does other stuff, like checking if you have the permissions to read that data, and also some business logic. But from a front-end point of view, it doesn't really matter what happens inside the backend. The API is all what matters. Now, as your application grows and you have more and more data entry points, your application is going to start looking like this. So every time you want to show the user any kind of data, you're going to make an API call to the backend, and this is going to go to the database, and this does not scale at all. And we also have the case where we're showing the same data in multiple places in the UI, and you somehow have to manage the data and only get it once from the backend. And this is where React Query or TanStack Query comes. And what TanStack Query does is that it acts as a proxy between your UI and your backend. And the cool thing about TanStack Query is that it takes care of a lot of problems related to async state management and really simplifies this whole data fetching process. It provides you with loading and error states that you can use in your application. And the cool thing about TanStack Query is that it actually doesn't really care about what kind of protocol you are using and how you are getting your data. So it doesn't matter if you're using SOAP, REST, RPC, GraphQL, you can simply define how to get your data, and TanStack Query takes care of the rest. And if we take a look on how we use TanStack Query till now, we normally define queries and mutations. And queries are just functions to get data from the backend, and mutations are used to change data on the backend. So a typical query would be, for example, if we have a phone book application where you can save your contacts, you're going to have a query called used contacts that returns all the contacts, and maybe another one called use contact details, and this is going to give you all the details about a specific contact. On the other hand, we have mutations, like for example, use edit contact, and this function is going to allow you to change the data of a contact, and use delete contact to basically delete a contact. And for every one of these functions, we define how it interacts with the backend. Now, there is a second thing that we also need to do, and that is to define the dependencies between the queries and the mutation. And there is a reason for that. So every time that you call a mutation, you are changing the data on the backend. And of course, we need to invalidate that cache so that if you are using these contacts and showing them somewhere in the UI, they need to be updated as well. So there is this manual synchronization that happens between mutations and queries. And we should also keep track of that manually as developers. So what we are doing here as developers is basically building a manual or pseudo sync engine where we're trying to keep track of what is happening in the backend and updating that data in the cache on the front end. This is of course error prone, and it's also really repetitive. Like once you start using React Query for a while, you're going to see that it's really repetitive. Another thing that we have in React Query is how hard it is to implement optimistic updates. Optimistic updates is when you show the user the result without waiting for the server to respond. And in this case, if you delete a contact, we just want to show it to the user directly. You don't have to wait 2 seconds for the server to answer before showing that to the user. And optimistic updates is something that the users are used to, and just makes your app feel snappy and fast. Now, one interesting thing about APIs, especially once you start using them for a while, you figure out that they are actually under the hood just collections. And we're talking about create, read, update, and delete operations. And while you can define your APIs in a different way, all the good APIs or all the good practices in creating APIs do recommend implementing them as collections. And something else to keep in mind is that no matter what your business logic is, you're always gonna end up creating the same pseudo sync engine, basically synchronizing between the mutations and the queries manually. So it actually doesn't matter what protocol you are using or what your data type is. At the end of the day, we just have a collection that we make changes to, and we want to show those changes to the user. So how does this actually relate to TanStack DB? The great thing about TanStack DB is that it's built from the ground up based on collections. So as a developer, you only need to define these functions: how to create, read, update, and delete an item of a collection. And once you've done that, you have access to a live collection that you can directly use in the UI. So you can read and write to this collection without even having to worry about mutations and queries and trying to keep them synchronized. Out of the box, it comes with optimistic updates and live updates, and that's why it's called Live Collection. Internally, TanStack DB has an in-memory database, and it orchestrates making API calls to the backend to keep the backend state and the front-end data synchronized. As I said before, I have taken this for a spin. I have this application here. This is a simple contacts list that I have used in my previous videos. And here you can create a contact. So each contact has like first and last name, phone number, and an address. It's very simple. You can edit it here and save. And you also have the possibility to delete a contact. And I have originally implemented this using React Query. And I took the same code and I translated it to TanStack DB. And I want to show you how the code looks like, and also the cool little things that you only figure out once you use it in the code. So this is all you need to create a collection in TanStack DB. You have this function create collection that comes from TanStack React DB, and here we're gonna pass in a query key just to identify this collection, the query client, and then you can define your functions. So here we have this query function, and this is getting the data from the backend. You have to define a special function to identify each item in your collection, and then you have your other methods on insert, on update, and on delete. And here we are making the API calls to the backend. So here, for example, on update, you can get all the data about this transaction, and here we're just grabbing the modified data and make an API call to the backend. And once we have this, you can create your own custom hooks. For example, use contacts. It uses this use live query that also comes from TanStack DB. And here we have a query object, and you just define from which collection you want to get your items. Here I have a use contact details that gets a contact ID as a parameter. And here, just like before, we are grabbing the data from this contacts collection. We are applying a filter and checking that the contact ID equals the one that we pass in as a parameter. And we are also limiting the results by 1. And when it comes to mutations, you can actually call this function directly, contacts collection that delete. And in this case, I have decided to create a custom hook just to have the same API. And that way I don't need to change all the components. And the interesting thing here is that we don't have any loading or error states anymore. We just have one global loading and error state. So as a developer, you don't have to always show a loading state and an error or success state for the user. The changes are applied directly and reflected to the users. If you check the application again, if you delete a contact, it just happens automatically, and the API calls are just made in the background. So there is a little bit of inversion of control going on here, but I think that's a price that I'm ready to pay. Now, as I said before, there are two things that are missing in this API that stopped me from actually using it in production. First of all, there is no way of handling partitioning in collections. So if you have an endpoint that returns only a page of the results or like a part of the results, and then you have to call it again to get the next page, then it doesn't really work with TanStack DB. There's no way of handling that yet. I think there's a pull request open if I'm not mistaken, but I've seen that there is already a discussion about that. Now, the second thing that is missing in TanStack DB is that while there is a possibility to have selectors in normal queries, I didn't find a possibility to have a kind of a global selector. For example, here I have this use contacts count, and I just want to have the length of the contacts. I didn't find the built-in way to do this with selectors. Maybe the feature is already there and I just didn't see it in the documentation, but still, that's something I just wanted to highlight. So that's it for TanStack DB. I'm really eager to know if you guys are already using it or if you have checked it out before as well. Thanks again for watching. And by the way, if you are interested in all React and TanStack libraries, then please check out my other videos. I have created a lot of videos that go really deep in these libraries. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.